Welcome, everybody, to those who are filtering in. We are just going to wait a couple of moments so that everybody can log on. Welcome, everybody. Do make yourselves comfortable, get yourself a cup of tea, get yourself sorted, and we will start in just a moment. While people are filtering onto the webinar, I will just do a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording tonight's webinar, so if you have registered and you would, for any reason, like to look back at sections, you can watch this on repeat if you like. We will also have time for some Q&A towards the end of today's webinar. So you can either submit some questions through the chat function or through the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen. And then I will pose those to our lovely speaker, Rachel, towards the end of tonight's webinar. We are covering today's topic, why US university applications begin in year 10. It is predominantly a guide for parents, but if there are students here, welcome. You will hopefully appreciate all there is to hear today. And really, we wanted to kickstart the application for process for people who might be aware that we've got students submitting their applications at the moment. We're really in the thick of it, and you're probably looking ahead to a couple of years' time and thinking about what kind of decisions do you need to make now, what will be important to bear in mind, and Rachel will talk through all of that. So I think we've probably got everybody settled on the call now. If you could flip to that second slide, I will just share a little bit more about who we are at A-List. I'm Alison, and you'll probably tell from my accent, I'm a Brit. This is where I started my education consultancy journey just over 10 years ago now. I tend to focus on Oxbridge and Russell Group. It was about 5 years ago that within Dukes, I connected our different teams and started also working across A-List. A-List was founded in New York over 20 years ago now by a team of Ivy League graduates who were keen to demystify this process and make information about applying to university more accessible to students who were just starting out. We are based in London, although we do have international presences around the world, including in Shanghai and in New York. And based on our 20 plus years of experience, we feel we really know what it takes in order to be successful, particularly as an international applicant to the US. We're part of a wider team, as I hinted to, and as part of that team of university experts, we are proud to be trusted by 80% of the UK's top schools. I am now going to hand over to Rachel. I'm so excited that she could join us today. Rachel is from Los Angeles, California, is a double-barred attorney, which makes a really interesting experience for our students to learn about, and has educational experience spanning both the US and the UK, which she will tell you a bit more about. So she has that intersectional experience of both systems, which are so different, and also experience from both sides of the desk as somebody who has worked in law school admissions and also directly with students who are going through this. I think that's all from me. You'll hear from me for the Q&A, but now thank you, Rachel. I'll let you go for it.
Thank you, Allison. I'm really excited to have everyone today. As Allison mentioned, we are kind of in the thick of applications, so it's always good to put this on the top of our parents' mind, just because the earlier we can start, the better. And I'll go into that in a little bit in the presentation. Today, we're going to go over kind of the basics of US universities and how they differ from the UK system, what that process looks like, what is holistic admissions process is, the academic benefits of starting early, as well as opportunities to take standardized testing and preparation for that, which again is important to do early, the role of personal development and essay writing. I mean, that's kind of where, for me and my students, the rubber really hits the road. And I feel like I can make the most difference with my students and developing their personal statement and their personal narrative. Strategic decision making and relationship building, reducing last minute pressure, and then we'll finish with a Q&A. So here's kind of a comparative list between US universities and UK universities. Some of you might be familiar and some of you might not be, but typically in the US, universities are 4 years long, and in the UK, those are 3 years. And one of the main differences that I point out to my students is often that because of that time difference, there's an additional year in which you are kind of allowed and definitely encouraged to explore more of kind of the liberal arts background. Typically, most universities in the US have a year of what's called like a core program. And that will be a year in which students are really encouraged to find out what they want to learn. And that kind of goes into what majors and what topics students want to learn in the US versus the UK. In the UK, you kind of go in knowing exactly what you want to study and studying that. And then if you choose to change that major, you'll have to retake some time in the UK. In the US, also, they are more focused on a system of continuous exams. So that looks like a grade breakdown of not only final exams, but also maybe weekly quizzes or sporadic essays. Versus in the UK, there's a high emphasis on final exams. Here in the US, or at least in the US, there's more of a liberal arts approach to education, which is again kind of what I mentioned in that students are encouraged to study many different things versus in the UK, there's a single honors program. A big sell for US universities is a campus life. Most of my students are really, really keen to explore what it's like to go to university in a integrated campus where there's, you know, the dining hall and sports and residential halls kind of in the same area, which is pretty unique to American universities as well. And in the application process, it's really, really different in terms of US universities and UK universities because there they really look at kind of holistic applications. And we'll go into that in a few slides on what that means versus in contrast to academically focused, although definitely American universities are still incredibly focused on academics. This slide is going to go over some of the competitiveness of US versus UK universities. And the thing I'd really like to point out here that there's just exponentially more universities in the US versus the UK. And you can also apply to as many as you want, although typically there our students apply to about 8 to 12 applications. Here's where I really think it's important to have some advice in terms of finding out what type of universities students want to go to. Of course, students always want to apply to the big name brand universities, right? Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, we have here. I think part of the benefit of having an outside consultant come in and give some on the ground knowledge is there's some amazing universities in the US, again, over 4,000. And not all of them are known internationally, although many of them are very incredibly well known in the States, right? So if you're looking for universities that are a little more maybe niche and a little more focused to what your student wants to learn, that's definitely something that we can help with. This next slide, for example, I'm not sure how many people are even aware of Caltech, which is the most selective university on this list and is in my hometown of Pasadena, California. And even here, there's some universities that, you know, a lot of international students don't know the difference between, for example, Northeastern and Northwestern. And here, that's where I can really help and kind of sort out the wheat from the chaff. Like, what does your student really want to do? And what university will help them kind of grow as an individual, as an adult in that context. I think I always tell my students that, you know, in an ideal situation, my goal is never for them to necessarily get into, you know, the best university, to the Harvard or Caltech, although that's definitely encouraged, because if that's not aligned with what they want, even if they get into Harvard and then the next year they transfer out and they really hate it, that's definitely not even a win in my book, you know. And so I think it's really important to match the student to their aspirations and their growth, whether that does look like name brand universities, which we definitely get a lot of, but more importantly, how that fits into the students, again, personal growth, personal branding, and how they kind of grow up as an adult. This slide kind of touches on the holistic admissions process before we really go into it. And Oh, it looks into actually how to choose a university. And here's kind of what I was talking about. So there's over 4,000 institutions, and some of these universities, there's so many factors to think of, right? Campus type, funding availability, competition, teaching type, academic opportunities, location. I think a lot of students who are international, they're not as familiar with, what would life in Chicago look like, right? If I went to Northwestern, what would life in Ithaca, New York look like if I attended Cornell? So again, I think this is really important to figure out and sort through because there's from an international standpoint, there's not many opportunities to really get to know all of these universities, especially if you start last minute, which is why we really encourage students to start looking into ideals of what they really want to know and learn about and how they best study before they really choose their universities. Next, we'll go into the holistic admissions process and how this differs from the UK system. This is a really interesting quote that I found to really epitomize the difference between American admissions and UK admissions. So importantly, this quote says that we have long held that students should not make decisions based on what they think they will get them into college, but instead based on values and interests that are important to them. And I love this quote, and this definitely kind of highlights what I tell my students on a day-to-day basis. One of my students the other day, she was asking if this one part of an essay would still fit in terms of her personal statement, which we'll go into those details next. But she asked if it would still fit. And I told her that she had mentioned this moment and how important it was for her in most of the sessions we've had for the last number of weeks. And I was telling her that if she kept reminding me that it was important, there must have been a reason why it was important to really dig deep and see what that was about. And that's exactly what I think this quote kind of determines, right? It's that we want to, or admissions officers, they want to see what has been important to you and how did you grow from that. I think oftentimes on the receiving end, having read, hundreds, thousands of admissions essays, it's really obvious when a student is just trying to feed the reader what they think they want to hear. And I think the most impactful essays come from ones that are genuinely based again on values and interests that are important to the students themselves. Here's kind of a graphic that helps people understand what elements are important in holistic admissions. Again, it's really different from UK admissions in that it's not only grade based. And I would say that all of these different bubbles are weighted in different percentages and are different for every university. Some of the ones that are really important are obviously academic transcript, as I mentioned, supplemental essays, personal statement, SAT scores, interviews. The one that I really, really want to bring up that I think is really different from UK admissions is demonstrated interest. And that is a factor that most universities bring up in that how committed is this student to really be interested in our university? I always also tell my students that if you think about it from a university standpoint, they want you to graduate there and for people to say, oh, that's amazing. Rachel went to XYZ university. Like she's ours. And I think that that kind of ties into the demonstrated interest. What would make you a really compelling portion to this campus life? And that's something that they definitely consider in a way that's not considered for UK universities. Other aspects are obviously extracurricular activities, which we can go into in a little bit as well. Here's kind of where the rubber meets the road for me, where I think the really important academic benefits of starting early for, again, as we kind of go into the late months of application season, you can really see which students are prepared and have been preparing for this in a way that has made the process easier. I've had a number of students who were able to luckily submit all of their applications before Thanksgiving. And that's kind of the type of students that have been preparing for this for at least a year or two. And here I really want to emphasize that you really can't compress 4 years of meaningful growth into a single year. And that's why year 10 is the ideal time to begin. The number one thing that I think falls out of students' consideration is that preparing early positions students for prime applications to merit-based scholarships. So I think most students are of the mindset that if I get the application in on the right time, the deadline of let's say January 5th, then I'll get in and everything will be great. What they're not considering is certain universities like the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, their deadline for being automatically considered for a merit-based scholarship is December 1st. So that's really big if you think about it, because some students thinking that their actual deadline is January 15th, they're going to completely miss that December 1st deadline. And that's kind of where it's easy money in a sense, right? It's if you've prepared early and you have your entire application, your personal statement, your supplemental essays ready, and you can just submit them on December 1st, you're going to automatically be accepted. I mean, not be accepted. You're going to automatically be considered for a merit-based scholarship. And so those are some really important dates and why it's really important to start planning for these dates and deadlines early. Another thing that I mentioned earlier is demonstrated interest, so sustained commitment and growth over time. One of the main things that I try to teach my students is how to craft and start early with their personal marketing skills and how to make experiences, meaningful to people. How do you make people care? And one of the frameworks I give them is moment, meaning, growth. And oftentimes, a lot of students are really great at saying, this is the moment and this is how I learned from it. And that's amazing. I think the thing that most students are missing that really differentiate them is that third piece, which is growth. And so if you're able to start, extracurriculars early, let's say in year 10, and you're able to have, for example, one of my students, she started this project in year 10 and now she has created a bin that helps her campus recycle more. And if you start that activity year 12, there's just not enough runway for you to make the impact that you want to make, to show that you can make impact. Those are really big. And so I think that oftentimes if you don't start early, you're kind of limited by that shorter runway of just having maybe an important moment and how that's changed you, but you can't have any tangible necessarily like skill or output to say that you have, changed your community in XYZ way. And I think that's always something that's really, really important for universities who are looking for applicants. Another thing that I like to flag for your parents is activity panic in year 11 and 12. And so what this looks like is a student whose, list of activities is empty or maybe a little bit disjointed. And then all of a sudden, year 11, year 12, they try to do, 10 different new clubs. And it's kind of the same issue that I highlighted earlier, is that once you join those new clubs, it's really obvious to the admissions officer what you're trying to do. Unfortunately, we are very aware of that element. But more importantly, they won't really get as much of that growth, and it'll appear as if they, don't necessarily have the excitement, the longevity that universities are really looking for, especially when you think of contributing to their university campus. Something that I touched on earlier is time to begin working on university lists and start early research. So hopefully, if students are lucky, they get to visit their universities before they apply. I always find that incredibly useful because there's nothing like, as much as I can explain to a student, what Ithaca, New York is going to feel like, you can't really explain that to a student in the same way that visiting will, or just because American universities have such a different college campus atmosphere as universities here. You won't be able to experience that unless you do have a longer runway and have kind of the bandwidth to visit universities earlier, because that kind of tacks on to this last moment, which is reducing stress while balancing important A-level exams and GCSEs. Typically, students, if they've started this process a little later, most students do want to go visit the universities they might attend. And they might be really, really keen to do that. The thing is, if they really have to focus on their grades, they want to get good scores, there's just not going to be that much time. And so, giving a longer runway for students to kind of firm up their university list and see what type of atmosphere they're like, especially because it's so different to that in the UK, is really important and will reduce the stress of balancing this with their A level exams. Importantly, for parents, also, it will help exponentially when your kid is not, rushing at the end and stressing you out. And so, definitely, that's a factor because I hope that students, when they start early, it kind of alleviates stress and pressure from not only themselves, but more importantly, their entire family. Because looking back, in a few months from now, 5, 6 months from now, May 1st, that's all the university declaration deadlines. And so we try to keep that into the forefront of our students and our parents' mind, just because that's the day that we're all looking for. If we can get there smoothly and get the result we want, that's what we're going to try to help facilitate. Importantly, also, there are better chances at competitive summer programs when, frankly, you're aware of the dates, you're aware of the deadlines. And even if that looks like something that a student may not continue the summer after, it's always good experience, even if it is, trying to, attending a program at a university over the summer and seeing what that's like, seeing what living abroad for the first time would look like. All of those are definitely important in terms of starting early and will help kind of grow the substantive nature of a student's application. Next, we're going to talk about opportunities to take standardized testing. I mean, there's been a lot of discourse, obviously, about whether tests should be optional and whether they shouldn't be. Ultimately, at the end of the day, test optional doesn't mean test irrelevant. And so, as much as, we really support students who are creating a really holistic application profile, at the end of the day, there is an element of scores that do matter. If you're thinking about an applicant, and if I were the admissions counselor, and two are relatively equal in terms of scores, high school scores, and extracurriculars. If there's a student who has like an amazing SAT score, it's almost a non-negotiable. It's definitely a weight that can 1,000% help not only in the admissions process, but also importantly in the scholarship and merit-based aid element, because that's always going to strengthen your application as a whole. It also creates a benchmark for school competitiveness, just because some high schools now, if they might be giving everybody A's and there might not be enough knowledge from the admissions counselor's perspective to know if that A or those scores are really accurate. And also, it's important to see that test optional policies are expiring, and it's still often used as an important benchmark for the students' level of competitiveness. Here, typically, either exam is accepted, either the ACT or the SAT, so whichever one kind of goes to your students' strengths is typically the one that we suggest. And again, the lovely advisors at A-List can help with preparing for that. The next thing we're going to discuss is the role of personal development and essay writing, which is really somewhere that I feel like my skills and most advisors' skills can really help students the most. And you might be wondering how these application statements differ. So here we have an example. And so for the UCAS, it's way more formal and concise and almost lists facts in a sense that avoids storytelling. And the total is 4,000 characters. So here in this example, this student is writing that, geography is also critical to developmental economics. I am fascinated to show how that affects people. And then kind of going on to what subjects and what topics they relate to. Here, the US personal statement is a lot more driven by narrative and a lot more driven by, again, as I mentioned, moment, meaning, and growth. It allows students to share their story and values in a very personal way. And it's 650 words, which on the outside looking in may seem like not a lot, but typically my students are often running over that limit because there's just so much that they want to say, which is an amazing thing. Here's an example of the personal statement that might show up from a student's perspective. So, the possibility that we were lost was terrible to me. It would mean every painful step we were taking was useless and that I had failed to lead. Nervous to express my doubts, I mentally planned my words before sharing my fear. And so, I think here, even from the beginning, you can tell that it is really introspective, requires a lot of introspection from the student, and requires a lot of honesty. And I think the thing that most students and parents get wrong about this is that they can write the draft of a personal statement in a day, which I think a lot of students, given that they are so academically gifted, they're just used to writing one first draft and having that be their final draft. I would say that on average, most of my students have typically 6 to 8 drafts of their personal statement. And that doesn't even count some of the ideating that we go through together in the beginning. And so, yes, if you start late, you will have time to write a personal statement. I wouldn't say that you would have time to write a great personal statement because the personal statement takes so much, self-reflection. There's a lot of elements of, figuring out why a student has done this and, creating that narrative, crafting that narrative in a way that just honestly takes time. My number one piece of advice that I got while studying for the bar exam was sometimes you just need to take a break from writing, from studying, and then you'll have that, shower aha moment in which you're like, oh, yes, of course, that makes sense to me now. And I think it's the same with the personal statements. And I tell my students to take breaks as needed to help their writing, just because it takes a while for your subconscious to process what's going on. And unlike in the UCAS applications, these personal statements need a level of depth and need to show a level of growth that you just honestly can't have when quickly write a 650 word essay about yourself, the night before something is due. That's just not, I haven't seen it. I'm sure there could be writers that great or that introspective, but in my experience, sometimes you just need a little more leeway just to, reflect on that growth, which in and of itself is really, really important for these young teens. Here we're going to go into the supplemental questions. So often another issue that students face is they write their personal statement. They've spent weeks thinking about how they've grown, and then they're like, Rachel, great, I'm done. And as much as I congratulate them on finishing that portion of the application process, I would say that is only 50% of the issue. The other 50% comes in all of these supplemental questions. Most high tier universities, they have at least 2 to 3 supplemental questions. And that can look like a lot of different questions, right? For example, here, Harvard University asks, describe a time when you strongly disagreed with someone about an idea or issue. How did you communicate or engage with this person? What did you learn from this experience? Right? Stanford asks, what historical moment or event do you wish you could have witnessed? And again, all of these require a level of really deep depth and consideration. Of course, there are some overlapping questions, but I say that for my students who have great grades, great SATs, great personal statement, most of the students who are applying to Harvard, Dartmouth, Duke, Stanford have great SATs, great grades, great personal statements. It's kind of here that you can differentiate yourself in a way that's substantive and important. And again, unfortunately, that's not the sort of activity that is often completed well the night before something is due. And it requires definitely a bit of thinking. And as most of my students have realized in this late hour of mid-December, is a lot of these universities require more supplemental questions that are deep and introspective than you would think. So my worst case scenario is a student logs on to their Common App website and they see that Harvard has, they think that they're done, they've completed their personal statement. They log on to Harvard and there's 4 supplemental questions. They all require at least 5 edits to each question. And so again, having these on your radar early, knowing what's expected, knowing these what your end goal will be will kind of help make all this process easier. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of these questions, some of them can, the same situation can be repeated. So it's just about creating that narrative and spending the time to frame those stories for each student. Next, we're going to talk about strategic decision making and relationship building. Here are kind of the elements to the Common App that I alluded to a little earlier. The profile, so demographic information, where you're from, family, who your parents and siblings are, whether they've attended other universities or the university that you're applying to, your education, which schools you've attended, which summer schools you've attended, any awards, obviously testing, which is a huge part of it. Activities, they'll have them list up to 10 extracurricular activities. Writing, a big one, again, as I mentioned, that I spend the most time with my students on: personal statement, supplemental essays, additional information, and also any counselor letters, letters of recommendation, your school profile. Those are kind of all of the elements that tie into what make a Common App. Next, we're going to talk about reducing last minute pressure, which again, I think is important, not only for the student, but also for the parents to make sure it's not a painful process. Here, another factor that I didn't necessarily mention earlier when we were discussing choosing your university and creating those university lists early is the concept of early acceptance and early decision admissions. I'm not actually sure if schools in the UK do this. I don't think they do, but there are a lot of universities in the States that prioritize and or maybe prefer an early application or an early admission. And what does that look like? So most of these schools will have their regular deadlines, as you've seen, as January 1st, January 15th. Those are the most common dates. There's also an earlier date, and that can be either binding or non-binding, where students can apply earlier, and the rate of acceptance, brutally honestly, is higher. So here, for example, Cornell University, their overall acceptance rate is 8%, and their early acceptance rate is 18%. I mean, that's about double their regular acceptance rate, maybe more. Here, for example, Dartmouth College, their overall acceptance rate is 6%, or the regular acceptance rate is 5%, and their early acceptance rate is 21%. That's 4 times more than the regular acceptance rate. And so having all of these universities starting early, visiting the universities, seeing if that's the university that your student wants to attend, and then give themselves a competitive advantage by applying early action or early decision. Those are timings that are incredibly important. And again, timings that you can't make last minute, decisions that you can't necessarily make last minute, because there are a lot of students who will start reviewing their essays later. Pretty much November is typically when there's a big rush for students to start their applications. At that time, you only have a few weeks to meet the early deadline if you've made it at all. And again, these deadlines are also really important for that earlier comment that I made about merit-based scholarships, because a lot of universities have these kind of sneaky, we would prefer for you to apply by December 1st deadlines, right? Whether that is for admission or entrance into opportunities to obtain merit-based scholarships, or if that's for early acceptance, early decision acceptances. And so that's kind of why all of these deadlines are important. I think outside looking in, it's easy to see that, oh, I have until January 1st, January 15th, but I think it's definitely a mistake to start looking so late and start considering these factors so late. So I've rambled on now for a little bit of time. I wanted to open up the floor to any questions. I feel like, often I handle so many of these students that sometimes I forget some of the easier questions. So I'll hand it to Allison to kind of moderate and suggest any questions that we can discuss now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that informative and interesting presentation, Rachel. I've worked sort of alongside US applications for a number of years now, and it still strikes me just how distinct these two educational philosophies are and our expectations. So, yes, we do ask our students if they're applying for the UK and the US, which many increasingly are. We note that strong applicants, well prepared applicants, can be successful for both systems, but they're often spending their time doing quite different things. We would absolutely welcome your questions. So I will give you a couple of moments to type something out into the chat or the Q&A box. You'll also see on the screen there is a QR code. Our invitation following today's webinar is that you reach out to us. The link there sends you to our Calendly where you can book an appointment to chat to the team. It's totally free. And we find that because every family situation, every student situation is unique, we can often give you the best answer to your question that way, and we'd welcome a chat with you. I will pick out our first question for you, Rachel. Are scholarships to non-US citizens common, or anything you could tell us about this topic?
Yes. So I would say that scholarship, I would say let me start out by saying there's probably two type of what you would call scholarships. There's one which is need-based and one which is merit-based. Typically, as an international student, you're not going to qualify, like asterisk, you probably will not qualify for a need-based scholarship. However, merit-based scholarships are just that they're given to students who have shown exceptional, XYZ, whether that's just exceptional people. And those students can be international or from wherever. And so while I don't think it's likely that an international student will obtain financial aid from the need-based category, I think it's very common, and I do see that very regularly, that international students, if they frame their experiences and have the right combination of grades and extracurriculars and everything, they often make really compelling stories enough for universities to want to offer them merit-based scholarships. So it's definitely possible in that realm. And I think, again, that's kind of where the early planning feeds into it, because I don't think international students will not gain a competitive advantage necessarily just by saying they're international, right? It's kind of about the whole story and what does the whole story look like. So in that regard, I think international students are typically well positioned to create great narratives to allow for merit-based scholarships.
Finances, I mean, that's a really hefty topic. And it also is giving a full answer on something like that often requires actually a little bit more of a conversation. And one resource that I think is super useful if you're looking at the affordability of US education, because that is the elephant in the room. It is a much bigger investment than a UK university, especially if you're not able to tap into the same financial supports as you are in the UK. There are net fee calculators available. Harvard, for example, has one, and it requires you to put in a bit of your personal circumstances, and then you get a more bespoke information out. In terms of scholarships, though, we're very proud of our student success. Many of our students are UK based. They're not necessarily US passport holders, and so fall into this category of being an international applicant. And consistently, our students win Moorhead Keynes Scholarship, Robertson, Jefferson, full ride scholarships in the context of athletic recruitment. So we have a lot of experience with these prestigious scholarships, which are worthy of going for in and of themselves, but also then, have attached to them some kind of financial component as well. Next question, how do you find the right counselor? Rachel, do you have a sense of perhaps students that tend to be the right fit for you? And then I can share a bit more about our team as a whole.
Yeah, I would say that for me, I think that students that are the right fit are typically students who maybe have a little more of a liberal arts interest, so are either really keen to study, international relations or politics or English language or economics versus traditional mechanical engineering, just because I don't have as close of a relationship with or understanding with what that requires, although in a sense those applications are consistent of the same sort of elements of as we've discussed. I would say that a student will be able to tell when their counselor is right for them when you're getting enough out of it. If you're feeling like you're reviewing personal statements over and over again, you're not getting necessarily the feedback that's resonating with you. That could just mean that both the counselor and the student, have different ways of communicating, and that says nothing negative about either party, but it does say that maybe there's a better fit in terms of alignment of communication style. And I think that that's your it's a really good thing not only to honor that feeling but also to, I guess, be able to utilize those tools as well as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of our strength in A List, I think, is the strength of our team, it's the strength of our people, and also the diversity of backgrounds that we have in our team. So, for some candidates, it's about speaking with someone who has admissions experience at an Ivy League school, or a well-connected expert in athletic recruitment for their particular sport. And then other times we might make a recommendation about a college counselor based on personality. Is the student wanting encouragement, structure, discipline? What is it that they need in order to make a success of this process? And so it's something we can absolutely advise on an individual basis as well. Next question, and they're starting to come in, so that's fantastic. Will applying to an American university from the UK make me stand out as an applicant, or is it irrelevant?
Ooh, I will say, as any good lawyer will say, that it depends. I think if you are trying to use your status as an international student as the only identifier, as the only thing that will make you stand out, a lot of universities have international students and are really happy to have international students. So that if that's the only kind of competitive advantage that you want to rely on, then that I would encourage you to, rely on other elements that make you interesting. I will say that having I will say there are a number of students who apply to state schools. So that's UCs, that's UCLA, UC Berkeley, UT Austin, those kind of schools. They're, those universities legally have a preference towards in-state students. Does that mean that your application will be overlooked? No. But it does mean that we want to craft an interesting and compelling narrative for you. So again, it depends, is my lawyerly answer.
I think if you're a well-prepared UK applicant, you really do stand out against other UK applicants. I don't mean that in a bad way. What I mean is, we're in the UK system, we're gearing our students up for a UCAS system, which is so different. And so that is understood. Admissions teams in the US do understand that there's not the same culture around the focus of people's time and what they're doing to prepare. So if you are well prepared, there's almost like there's an opportunity for the UK based applicant.
I
Next
will say on
question.
that note that I
Yeah.
think I forgot this earlier, but having worked with a number of UK students, the American application process is not really on their admissions officers' um, top of mind, right? And so I think a lot of them are really focused on the UCAS deadlines, but because there's so many different deadlines, there's a different deadline for every school. That can come as a disadvantage to some UK students just because their advisors won't have known, and or they would have had one advisor for their entire class to help with American universities, and that's kind of where that can hurt them in a sense.
Yeah. Will speaking many languages benefit an application?
Oh, that's a great question. I hate to give this answer again, but I think it depends. I think again, if I'm thinking about, Moment meaning growth. What does that mean, right? I don't think that listing certain skills that you have without the backstory, without understanding the growth, without understanding the impact of that is ever useful, right? And so, sure, you know XYZ language, but how have you utilized that? How has that helped you? How have you helped other people with that? I think that's kind of, again, where the rubber meets the road, not necessarily saying that I know like 11 different languages, which that is actually is quite impressive if you knew 11 languages. But I think more universities are looking towards, you know, how can this be applied here on this campus with us? And I don't necessarily find that like listing a number of languages that you know can be that useful. It's more about how you have applied those skills.
I give the same answer when I'm talking about the UCAS personal statement, and it's things like, should I do work experience? Um, is this summer school useful? And it's all about the way that it is explored and the meaning behind it rather than it being something to list. So, yeah. Does family background affect college acceptance chances, especially if the students' parents are alumni of top universities?
I think it's definitely a factor. I think earlier when we were looking at the Common App, I'll go back to this slide, Common App components, one of them is family, and that's kind of what you're talking about now is the legacy information. So it can be a factor. Again, there's no cut and dry rule of, you know, legacy equals 5% of your weighting or something like that. So it just has to be considered in the totality of the circumstances in this case.
Great. Are applications this year different versus prior years? Any key trends that we're noticing?
I guess in terms of key trend, I haven't noticed many differences in that sense. Um, yeah, I don't think that I've noticed too many differences.
The return of the return of the SAT, ACT, more colleges encouraging this or requiring this. To my mind, that's a really positive thing. Yes, another thing for the well-prepared applicant to control and work towards. But yeah, the culture of US admissions is fairly stable in terms of what is required of the student, even against a backdrop of noise in the media. And I mean, there is no time to get into that, but the different news stories and attitudes around international applicants. I think we could definitely do a whole session on that. But in terms of keeping it simple for our students, what is required of you? Actually, the culture of that admissions remains stable. Um, what's your consultation fee if someone needs your expertise? So we offer free 30-minute consultations. You're very welcome to reach out to us. We do have a paid consultation, which includes an in-depth report. So that's £395. That includes it's 75 minutes a working meeting with your consultant, and then it's followed up by a bespoke report, which includes the recommendations about schools, the timeline, the things that you ought to be considering from here. And we consider that standalone service in and of itself. We like to think that you would like to continue your journey with us, and we can definitely support you throughout the process. But equally, we think we're giving you a really good amount of information in order to get started and kickstart that application. Next question on international applicants. Are fewer international applicants being accepted now?
I can't speak to the actual numbers just because it's only been one cycle since, you know, things have gotten a little crazy. Um, and so, yeah, I'm not sure if I can exactly comment on that from the university standpoint.
We have an informal window into this, I guess, through the students that we work with, and we are the in-house college counselors, a number of schools in the UK, a number of some of the biggest US uni feeder schools, so for example, Westminster and Wellington College, and we haven't noticed demand drop. We've potentially seen people making decisions once they've got all of their offers in, and perhaps a few more swaying towards the UK, towards Europe. But we're noticing that demand is still there from international students, both in the UK and nearby.
Yeah, I
Next
would say
question.
that most, when I'm thinking about it from a visa perspective, most students from the UK and other European countries would not be as affected as some students from other countries.
Yes, agreed. What is something that US unis have that maybe other unis in other countries may not have? What is the learning environment like?
Oh, I really love this question because it gives an insight on what I guess makes an important contributor to a classroom. And the name of it is escaping my head, but we use this method of teaching in I think most undergraduate and particularly law school classes, in which the students engage in dialect and conversations to learn the outcome of, for example, case studies on their own. And I think that is something that's really unique to the US perspective. It's less didactic and less like, here are the elements of the case, and more of, we read a case and what are we learning from this? How is this different from things? How is this really the case? Is this the rule of law that's being applied? And how is that different amongst ourselves? And you kind of debate it to a solution, and with the guidance of the professor, obviously. And I feel like that in and of itself is such a distinguishing factor of the American education system because it allows that critical thinking skills. And, as at the end of the day, it might be easy for someone to, reiterate, the elements of negligence, let's say, but to have a student be able to kind of work out amongst themselves, like, why was there a duty of care there? I think that is something that's really exciting about the American education and system, and exciting about being able to contribute to an environment like that where you can learn not only from the teachers and the professors, but more importantly from each other.
I definitely agree. From the outside, that emphasis on teaching quality is strong in the US. And I think to turn that on its head, one of the advantages of a UK university that is often lauded is the closeness between teaching and research. And so undergraduates often get that window into research a little bit sooner. To my mind, actually, the best researchers, that I encountered at university, were not necessarily the best teachers. And it's
Mm.
almost as if that teaching quality is ring fenced at US schools. So I definitely think that's a great strength. And another thing I'm always struck by is the difference in expectation on participation, both in those classes and in an extracurricular sense, because you are welcome to go to Oxford or Bristol and remain anonymous, log on to your lecture or go to your class and not be involved in extracurriculars. But there is this expectation at US schools, you're a part of that community, and it's so mirrored by the differences in the application process. I mean, it makes total sense. Are you going to be a
Yeah.
good fit for the US? Well, tell us about who you are and your extracurriculars. Are you a good fit for the UK? Tell us how much you love your subject, because that's what we're expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to know that in American education systems, it's very much what you put in is what you get out. And so when you're putting in, active classroom participation in debates and going to office hours, those are things that, in my opinion, are more emphasized in the US academic setting.
I think we have answered all of your questions. Um, I would anticipate you might have questions which are perhaps more particular or personal to your particular family. And please do reach out to us. We're sort of old fashioned in this regard. We very much welcome having phone calls, having chats. We're a people to people kind of team. So please don't hesitate. And we work with families. We love to work with families from as early as possible because it can um, help us, inform the process and really build that long-term view of things. But wherever you're at in this process, please do reach out. And thank you so much, Rachel. Found it very interesting to hear from you. Really delighted to have you as one of our advisors in the team. And I think we will leave it there. So thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you.